The morning Ellen Bristol rode into the Hargrove cattle yard with nothing but a bedroll, a weathered saddle, and a reputation she had built from the ground up. Every man within eyeshot stopped what he was doing and stared at her like she had ridden in from the moon itself. It was the spring of 1874, and the town of Abilene, Kansas sat at the end of the Chisholm Trail like a dusty jewel, loud, crowded, smelling of cattle and whiskey and ambition in equal measure. The drive north from Texas was already being assembled. Hargrove's outfit was preparing to push 800 head of longhorn cattle from the Red River country up through Indian Territory and on to the stockyards, a journey of roughly 400 miles through some of the most unforgiving land in the American West. It would take months, test every man's resolve, and demand the kind of hard competence that could not be borrowed or bought. Ellen was 26 years old, broad-shouldered for a woman, with dark hair that she kept pulled back in a practical braid, and eyes the color of creek water in summer, a shifting, clear green that sharpened whenever she was thinking hard about something. She had grown up on a cattle operation in South Texas, daughter of Martin Bristol, who had run longhorns for 20 years before a bout of fever took him in the winter of 1871. Her mother had passed even before that, when Ellen was 12, and what that kind of upbringing produced was not a fragile creature. It produced someone who knew how to read grass and sky, how to talk to a spooked animal without raising her voice, how to navigate by stars, and how to stretch 3 days of supplies into 5 without complaining about it. She had worked the last 2 years helping smaller outfits piece together their drives, always in some auxiliary capacity because no trail boss would hire her on as a full drover. They would take her cooking, sometimes her scouting if they were desperate, but the moment she asked for a proper paying position as a cattle hand, the doors closed like shutters in a storm. She was told, plainly and repeatedly and with varying degrees of unkindness, that she had no business on a cattle drive. She had decided, quietly and without announcing it to anyone, that she was done being told that. Hargrove's foreman, a man named Colton Webb, saw her ride in and walked over with his thumbs hooked in his belt and the particular expression of a man who has already made up his mind before the conversation starts. He was built like a fence post, tall and lean with a jaw like carved hickory, and he had the kind of sun-beaten face that made it difficult to tell whether he was 40 or 60. "You lost, miss," he said, though his tone made it clear he knew she wasn't. "I am looking for the trail boss on the Hargrove Drive," Ellen said, keeping her horse still. "I understand you are taking on hands." "Taking on hands, yes," Webb said, "not taking on women." Ellen did not flinch at that. She had heard it enough times that it had stopped stinging somewhere around the 15th or 16th repetition. "My name is Ellen Bristol. My father was Martin Bristol out of Gonzales County. I have ridden on 4 drives, scouted 3 river crossings, handled remuda on a 2-month push, and I can out-navigate any man you have hired so far. I am asking for work." Webb studied her for a moment, then let out a short, flat laugh that was not unkind exactly, but was not particularly respectful either. "Go talk to Hargrove," he said, jerking his chin toward a low office building at the edge of the yard. "He will tell you the same thing I just told you, but at least he will do it with manners." Thomas Hargrove was a man who had made his money carefully and had strong opinions about how things ought to be done, which was to say he had strong opinions about how things had always been done. He listened to Ellen's pitch with his fingers laced on his desk and his expression politely closed, and then he told her, with genuine courtesy, that a cattle drive was no place for a woman, that he bore her no ill will, and that he wished her luck in finding something more suited to her nature. Ellen rode out of that yard with her jaw set and her eyes forward, and she went straight to the livery where she had boarded her horse, a compact and extraordinarily capable roan mare named Sable, and she sat on a hay bale and thought for a long time. The drive was leaving in 4 days, heading south toward the Red River to pick up the herd. The path they would take was known. The timing was known. and Ellen had ridden that country so many times she could have drawn it from memory in the dark. She made her decision before sundown. She would ride ahead, not with the drive, not behind the drive, ahead of it. She would ride the trail first, sight the water sources, check the river conditions, mark the grazing, identify any trouble brewing in Indian territory. The kind of work that a scout was supposed to do, but that most outfits handled poorly because they sent men who did not know the land. She would arrive at every major waypoint 3 days before the herd, leave markers and notes at the spots Hargrove's men would recognize, and she would do it on her own provisions, her own horse, and her own conviction. She was not asking for permission anymore. The first person who noticed she was gone from Abilene was a young man named Pete Gallagher who ran the feed store and had sold Ellen a week's worth of dried beans, jerked beef, and cornmeal that same evening. He thought nothing of it at the time. Lots of people bought provisions. Ellen rode south out of Abilene at dawn on a Tuesday morning in late April, the sky wide and pale, and the prairie grass beginning its green push after a cool spring. Sable moved under her with the kind of easy, ground-covering stride that experienced horses develop over years of long days, and Ellen settled into the rhythm of the ride with a feeling she had not had in months. It was not happiness exactly. It was more like purpose restored, like the satisfaction of a gate that has been stuck finally swinging free. She covered 35 miles the first day, camping at a spring she knew from a previous drive, where the water ran clean over white limestone and the cottonwoods were already leafing out. She made a small fire, cooked her beans, drank her coffee, and fell asleep looking at a sky so thick with stars that it seemed to press down on her like something alive. By the end of the second day, she had crossed into the territory she truly knew best, the rolling country south of the Cimarron River, where the grass was tall in the wet draws and the cattle would find good grazing. She stopped at the first major crossing point on the planned route and waded the water on foot, testing the depth and the bottom, checking the bank conditions on both sides. The crossing was solid. She left a mark on a cottonwood on the north bank, 3 notches in a pattern that any trail hand would recognize as a good crossing marker, and she sketched a quick note on paper she folded and tucked into a split branch at eye height. Water is good, bottom is firm, enter 50 yards upstream of the dead elm. She did not sign it, she did not need to. By the time she reached the Red River crossing on the 5th day out of Abilene, she had checked 4 water sources, walked 12 miles of intended trail route on foot to assess the ground, mapped 2 alternative paths around a stretch of boggy lowland that would have cost the drive 2 days and possibly some cattle, and had a brief, wary encounter with a small group of Comanche riders who watched her from a ridge for a while and ultimately rode on without incident. She had not made any threatening moves, had kept her hands visible and her pace steady, and had understood from years in this country that most encounters did not end in violence if you did not invite it. She was good at not inviting violence. She was also good at being honest about where genuine danger lay, which was mostly in bad water and bad weather and panicked cattle, not in the broad open spaces themselves. She reached the Red River 3 days ahead of the drive's own estimated arrival, just as she had planned. The river was up, not dangerously so, but enough to matter. She spent 2 full days working the banks, riding upstream and downstream both, identifying the best ford, timing the flow in the morning versus the afternoon, noting where the sandbars shifted and where the current was deceptive. She found a crossing half a mile upstream from the standard ford that was shallower and had a better approach angle on the south bank, where the cattle could be lined up with enough room to stage properly before entering the water. It would save time and reduce the risk of a stampede at the water's edge, which was a genuine hazard because longhorns did not always take to moving water with any enthusiasm. She camped on the north bank and waited, and on the morning of the 3rd day she heard the drive before she saw it, that low, constant sound of hundreds of cattle in motion, like distant thunder that never resolved, accompanied by the high whistling of drovers and the occasional crack of a rope on leather. They came up out of the south in a long, dusty column, the lead cattle already feeling the pull of the river smell on the air, and at the head of the riding men was a figure she had not expected. She had expected Colton Webb. She had expected Thomas Hargrove himself, perhaps. She had not expected a man she had never seen before, riding a tall black horse with the ease of someone who had spent so much of his life in a saddle that the ground felt foreign to him. Luke Alden was 29 years old, and he had been brought on as the drive's head scout and second in command just 3 days before departure, a last-minute addition after Hargrove's original scout had broken his wrist in a horse fall. He was not originally from Texas but from Missouri, and he had come west at 22 with the kind of restless energy that the frontier either breaks or shapes into something remarkable. It had shaped him. He was not a large man, but he was put together with a precise and functional quality, like a tool made by someone who cared about getting it right, lean and straight-backed, with dark brown eyes that moved with a quick, assessing intelligence, and a face that was not classically handsome, but was the kind of face you kept looking at, lined early from sun and weather, with a mouth that seemed always on the edge of either a difficult truth or a dry observation. He saw Ellen before anyone else did because that was simply his nature. He noticed things. She was sitting on the north bank of the Red River on a rock, eating an apple, with Sable standing behind her drinking from the shallows. Luke pulled his horse up and the men behind him adjusted accordingly, and for a moment nobody said anything. "Good morning," Ellen said. Luke looked at her, then at the river, then at the cottonwood bank behind her where he had already spotted her marker. Then he looked at her again. "You ride ahead of us," he said. It was not quite a question. "I did," Ellen said. "Your standard ford is passable but rough. Half a mile upstream the crossing is better. Shallower, firmer bottom, better staging room on your side." Luke was quiet for a moment. He looked up the river in the direction she had indicated. Then he said, "You walked both banks." "Both banks, both crossings, 2 full days of observation," Ellen said. "The upstream crossing is the better choice by a significant margin." Colton Webb had ridden up behind Luke by now, and his expression was something between irritation and disbelief. "That is the Bristol woman," he said. "Hargrove turned her away in Abilene." "I know who she is," Luke said, which was not entirely accurate since they had never met, but he clearly meant that he understood the situation. He looked at Ellen for another moment, and she looked back at him without any apology in her expression, and without any particular challenge either, simply a directness that said she had done her work and she knew it. "Show me the upstream crossing," Luke said. Webb made a sound behind him that might have been a protest, but Luke was already walking his horse along the bank, and Ellen fell in beside him without being invited, which seemed to her to be exactly the right thing to do. She walked him through everything. The angle of entry, the depth, the bottom condition, the way the current pushed on the downstream side, the spot where the lead cattle could be walked in to encourage the rest. Luke listened without interrupting, watching the water the whole time with the focused attention of someone who understood what he was looking at. He asked 2 specific questions about the depth at the deepest point, and about whether she had seen the level change over the 2 days she had been watching. She answered both with precision. "We will use this crossing," Luke said. He turned his horse back toward the herd. Ellen waited to see if anyone would say something else to her. Webb rode past her without speaking, which she took as a form of acknowledgement. Several of the drovers looked at her with curiosity and varying degrees of surprise, but none of them spoke to her either. The crossing went smoothly. It took the better part of a day to get 800 longhorns across a river, but it went as well as it possibly could have, with no animals lost and no serious incidents, and Luke Alden managed the whole operation with a calm precision that Ellen respected immediately. He was not a man who shouted when calm instruction would do. He was not a man who panicked when a situation required quick adjustment. He simply saw what was happening, decided what to do, and did it, and the men around him responded to that quality the way that people tend to respond to genuine competence, which is to say they trusted it without quite being able to explain why. That evening, after the herd was settled and the camp was established on the north bank with cook fires going and the smell of coffee moving through the cool air, Luke found Ellen at the edge of camp, where she was checking Sable's left foreleg for a small cut the horse had gotten on a rock during the crossing. "You are not on the payroll," he said. "I am aware of that," Ellen said, not looking up from the horse's leg. "You have been riding ahead of this drive for 5 days," he said. 6, counting today. Scouting terrain, marking crossings, leaving notes. Also finding an alternative route around boggy ground south of the Cimarron, Ellen said. "Which will save you 2 days and possibly a dozen head, since that ground would take cattle to the knee and you would lose some to injury and exhaustion." Luke was quiet for a moment. He was standing a few feet away with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly, and he was watching her work on the horse with an expression that she could not read from the side of her face, but that she was aware of in the particular way you become aware of someone's attention when it has a quality of genuine interest rather than casual observation. "Hargrove needs to know you are here," Luke said. "Hargrove told me I had no business on a cattle drive," Ellen said. She finished checking the leg, satisfied herself that the cut was minor, and stood up. She looked at Luke directly. "I disagreed with him." "You made a fairly compelling case for your position," Luke said, and there was something in his tone that was not quite amusement but was adjacent to it, a kind of honest appreciation that he was not trying very hard to conceal. "I am going to keep riding ahead," Ellen said. "I know this territory. I know the trail. You can ignore everything I leave you, or you can use it. I think you will use it, because you are not the kind of man who ignores useful information on principle." Luke held her gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "No," he said, "I am not." She rode out the next morning before the camp was fully awake, as she had every morning since leaving Abilene. She had Sable fed and saddled and was a mile north before the first cookfire smoke rose behind her. But something had shifted. She knew it had shifted, though she could not have said precisely how. There was a thread now between her and the man on the black horse, something thin but real, like a line of telegraph wire still being strung between two posts. She thought about it more than she intended to, riding north through the good spring morning. Luke Alden thought about it too. He spent the day managing the herd and talking to Hargrove, who had ridden with the drive from Abilene out of his own stubbornness more than necessity, and who was not pleased to learn that Ellen Bristol was somewhere ahead of them marking trail. Hargrove was not a bad man, but he was a man of his era in ways that made certain things simply invisible to him, and the idea that a woman might be the best scout in his outfit was one of those invisible things. He told Luke to deal with it. Luke told Hargrove that he had found the woman's information to be accurate and useful, and that he intended to keep using it, and that if Hargrove wanted to put her on the payroll, it would save everyone a significant amount of awkwardness. Hargrove said he would think about it, which Luke recognized as the particular form of resistance that eventually becomes acceptance under sufficient pressure of evidence. They used her alternative route around the boggy ground the following day, following the markers she had left, and it saved them exactly as much time as she had estimated. The drovers, who were practical men living practical lives, began to talk about the woman ahead of them with a different tone. Not all of them. There were 1 or 2 who maintained their skepticism with the dogged loyalty of a man attached to his opinions, but most of them came around to the simple logic that good information was good information regardless of who produced it. Ellen, meanwhile, was working her way north with the focused efficiency of someone who had something to prove and knew exactly how to prove it. She was not careless about her own safety, but she was willing to go further into uncertain territory than most of the men behind her would have been, because she understood the land and she understood risk, and she was not in the habit of confusing discomfort with danger. She reached the Cimarron River on a warm morning in early May, and she spent 2 days at the crossing while a thunderstorm came through from the northwest. The storm raised the river by 2 feet and made the standard crossing temporarily impossible, but she rode the banks in the rain, eating cold cornmeal and sleeping under a canvas sheet she had brought for exactly this kind of circumstance. And by the morning of the 3rd day, she had found a secondary ford 3/4 of a mile upstream where the river split around a long gravel island. Both channels were crossable if you staged the crossing right, moving the cattle across the first channel to the island and resting them there before taking them across the second. It would require patience, but it would work. She set up her markers and wrote out the approach in careful detail on 2 sheets of paper, one on each bank, folded into split branches the way she had been doing all along. And then she ran into something she had not anticipated. There was a man camped on the north bank of the Cimarron, not a cattle hand or a settler but a rough sort, the kind that the trail attracted the way honey attracted flies, and he had evidently been watching her for some part of the day before he came down to her camp that evening. He was large and unshaven, and had the particular attitude of a man who has decided that a woman alone in empty country is an opportunity rather than a person. Ellen was entirely unsurprised by his presence. She was not afraid, but she was not careless either. She kept the campfire between them, and she made sure her rifle was across her lap while she talked to him, and she was polite and firm and kept her tone level. He pushed a little, testing the edges of the situation, and she showed him the rifle in the most matter-of-fact way possible, not brandishing it but simply making its presence clear. And she told him that she had had a long day and intended to have a quiet night, and that she hoped he would respect that. He looked at her for a long moment and then went back to his own camp upstream, and she heard him leave before dawn. She did not write about this encounter in any of her trail notes. It was not information that the drive needed. It was simply something that had happened, and she had handled it, and she moved on. Luke found her notes at the Cimarron and stood reading them in the afternoon sun with the river running full and brown ahead of him. The 2-channel crossing, the gravel island, the staging instructions. He read it twice, then folded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket, which was a thing he noticed himself doing with a slight sense of self-consciousness that was unusual for him. "She did it again," said a drover named Hatch, reading over Luke's shoulder. "She did," Luke said. They made the crossing exactly as Ellen had described, and it went so smoothly that even Hargrove, watching from horseback on the south bank, had to allow that it was well done. That evening, Hargrove told Luke to find the woman and put her on the payroll. Luke found her at noon the next day because he rode hard to catch up, which was not something he typically did without a good practical reason. He told himself the reason was practical. He told himself it was about the drive. He found her at a spring in a dry hollow, sitting cross-legged on the ground with a map spread across her knees, making notes in a small leather-covered book with a stub of pencil. She heard him coming when he was still a 1/4 mile out and had turned to watch him approach with the composed attention she gave to most things. "She is on the payroll," Luke said, pulling up. Ellen looked at him. "You," he said, and something in his expression shifted briefly into something warmer and then composed itself again. Hargrove agreed. $40 a month, same as the other scouts. "The other scouts are not doing this work," Ellen said, gesturing at the map. $50, Luke said. Ellen smiled, which was something she did not do frequently but which, when she did it, had the effect of making the air seem different, lighter and more inhabited. It was a full smile without reservation, and Luke felt it like a physical thing. "When did you leave camp?" she asked. 4 in the morning. "You rode 4 hours to tell me this." "I also wanted to see the terrain ahead," Luke said, which was true and also not entirely the whole truth, and they both knew it, though neither of them said so. He stayed through the afternoon. They went over the map together, with Ellen explaining what she had found and what she anticipated for the next section of trail, and Luke contributing his own knowledge of the Northern Territory, and it turned out that they complemented each other in a useful and genuinely interesting way. Her knowledge of the southern route was more granular and precise, while his knowledge of the country north of the Kansas line was more extensive. They argued about one river crossing, amicably but with real engagement, each holding their position until the other found the flaw in it. And when Ellen turned out to be right about the better approach, Luke said so without any apparent difficulty. That directness impressed her more than she expected. They made camp at the spring that night, which was entirely practical since the spring was the best water source for 20 miles in any direction. And they sat at opposite sides of the fire with coffee, and talked for 3 hours in the way that two people who are well matched for each other sometimes do when they first have the chance, quickly, and at length, moving from practical matters to personal history, to opinions about things that had no practical relevance at all, finding each moment of agreement and each moment of productive disagreement equally interesting. She told him about her father and the cattle operation in Gonzales County, about learning to rope before she could properly saddle a horse, about the 2 years of doors closing in her face before she decided that she was going to stop knocking on doors and simply do the work regardless. She said it matter-of-factly, without bitterness, though the injustice of it was plain enough. She had been better qualified than half the men she had applied to work for, and she had been turned away every time not because of any failure in her abilities, but simply because of who she was. And she had eventually decided that the only answer to that was to be so indisputably good at the work that the argument against her became impossible to sustain. Luke listened to this with the kind of attention that does not fidget or interrupt, the kind that says the other person's words are genuinely landing somewhere. He told her about Missouri, about coming west with an older brother who had since settled in Colorado, about the early years of working cattle drives from the low end, before working his way up through competence and luck, and the occasional fortunate accident of being in the right place when someone needed a capable person. He had been in a few tight spots, a flood crossing on the Arkansas that had cost 3 men their lives, a drought season in '69 that had broken most of the outfits in the territory. And he talked about those things with the quiet honesty of someone who has been through enough hard weather to stop pretending that life is tidy. When the fire burned low, he said goodnight and rolled his blanket out on the other side of the spring, and Ellen lay on her back looking at the stars for a long time before she slept. She thought that if she were not careful, she was going to be in considerable trouble with this man. She was not sure she wanted to be careful. The next section of the drive crossed into Kansas, and the terrain shifted from the broken country of Indian Territory into the longer, more open swells of the southern plains. It was beautiful in a spare and serious way, all pale grass and wide sky and hawks hanging in the thermals, and Ellen moved through it efficiently and well, scouting the water and the ground and leaving her careful notes at every waypoint. But now, every 2 or 3 days, Luke rode ahead to find her. The first time, he came with a bag of coffee beans and the explanation that the camp cook had sent extra. Ellen was fairly certain the camp cook had done no such thing, but she accepted the coffee and made no comment about the explanation. The second time, he came with information about a group of settlers moving south who might cause the herd to scatter if the drovers were not warned, and that was entirely legitimate. But he stayed 4 hours after delivering the information, and they talked and argued and sat in a comfortable silence that felt surprisingly rare for both of them. The third time he came, he did not bother with an explanation at all. He simply rode up in the mid-morning, tied his horse next to Sable, and fell in beside her as she was walking a stretch of trail to test the ground. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. They walked for a while without speaking, and it was entirely comfortable, the kind of silence that only exists between people who have already said enough to each other that quiet is a form of communication rather than an absence of it. "I have been thinking," he said eventually. "About the trail?" she asked. "Not about the trail," he said. She looked at him sideways. He was looking forward, watching where they were going, but there was a quality in his expression that was open and slightly uncertain, and that uncertainty was interesting on a face that was otherwise quite composed. "Say what you mean, Luke," she said. He stopped walking. She stopped too, and they stood in the middle of the trail in the morning light, the grass tall on both sides, and he looked at her with an expression that had lost its composure entirely, which she found she preferred to the composed version. "I think about riding ahead every morning," he said, "and I am fairly certain it is not because I am worried about the trail conditions." Ellen held his gaze. Her heart was doing something undignified, and she was annoyed at it and also not particularly interested in stopping it. "I think about it too," she said, "when I hear you coming." He looked at her for a moment longer, and then he did something that surprised her, which was that he reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face with a careful and entirely deliberate gesture, and his fingers brushed her cheek in a way that was so brief and so gentle that it seemed to require some courage on his part, and she found that she was moved by that. "We have 100 miles of drive left," he said. "We do," she said. "A great deal can happen in 100 miles," he said. "It can," she said. "It already has." He smiled at that, and it was an unguarded smile, the real one rather than the one he used for practical purposes, and she thought that it was one of the finest things she had seen in a considerable time. They walked the rest of the trail section together, and then he rode back to the herd with what she could only describe as a lighter quality in his seat on the horse, and she watched him go from the rise above the trail, and then turn back to her work with the particular feeling of a person who has understood something important, but has not yet quite figured out what to do about it. The next challenge came from the weather. A storm system moved in from the northwest on a Monday, which she had seen coming for 2 days from the cloud formations on the horizon, and which she had warned the drive about in her trail notes. But storms in this country did not always behave as predicted, and this one was more severe than anyone had estimated. By the time it hit, she was 15 miles ahead of the herd, camped in a low swale with a good windbreak of limestone outcrops, and she stayed put for 2 days while the sky came apart above her. Rain drove sideways. Lightning worked the sky to the east. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in an afternoon, which was not unusual for Kansas in May, but was still shocking each time it happened. She kept Sable calm and kept herself dry under her canvas and ate cold food and slept in her boots and thought about the drive behind her, about 800 cattle in that kind of storm, about the men working through it, about Luke. She had not intended to worry about any specific person. She had been in this country long enough to know that catastrophizing about things you could not influence was a waste of resources. But she noticed, with an honest self-awareness that she valued in herself, that her thoughts kept returning to him during those 2 cold, loud days, not with panic but with a steady and genuine concern that felt different from anything she had felt about any person in a long time. Her father had been the last person she had felt that kind of concern about, the kind that lives in your chest like something anchored there. When the storm broke on the 3rd morning, she rode back south 2 miles to the last high ground and looked toward the drive, and after about an hour she saw the herd moving again, ragged but intact, and she exhaled and did not entirely pretend it was just about the cattle. She turned north again and pushed hard toward Abilene. The last stretch of the trail was 50 miles of good country, well grassed and relatively easy going, and Ellen covered it in a day and a half. She reached Abilene early in the morning on a Friday, the trail town already beginning to stir with the noise and energy of a place that never quite went all the way to sleep. She rode into the stockyards district and talked to a pen manager named Harkins, who she had dealt with before, and established what they already knew: the pens were ready, the buyers were in town, the logistics were in order. Then she found a room at a boarding house on the east side of town, paid a week's rent from the wages she had now technically earned, had a bath that she considered one of the finest experiences of her adult life, and slept for 11 hours. The drive arrived 3 days later, on a Monday afternoon, exactly on schedule, which was to say exactly as she had predicted it would arrive, moving up the last mile of trail with the practiced efficiency of men who had been pushing cattle for weeks and knew what the end of a drive felt like. Ellen was at the edge of the stockyards when they came in, watching from the rail fence, and she saw Luke at the front of the column, and he saw her at almost the same moment, and there was an interval of perhaps 5 seconds where they simply looked at each other across the dusty yard and said nothing and everything simultaneously. He rode over when the lead cattle were handed off to the yard men. He looked tired in the complete way that a trail drive produces, which is to say tired in his bones as well as on his face, but his eyes were as clear and direct as they had been every time she had looked into them. "We lost 6 head in the storm," he said. "Could have been 60. "I am sorry about the 6, Ellen said. "The route you found held up. The storm diverted us a little, but not enough to matter." He swung down from his horse and stood next to the fence where she was leaning, and he looked at her for a moment with that particular expression she had come to associate with him being about to say something he had decided not to hedge. "I am going to ask you something," he said. "Go ahead," she said. "Have dinner with me," he said. "Tonight." Not as a scout talking to a trail foreman. As he paused briefly, which was unusual for him. As two people who have spent the better part of 2 months riding toward and away from each other, and who I believe might benefit from staying in the same location for a while. Ellen looked at him for a moment. She thought about all the times she had heard him coming across the empty country, about the strand of hair he had tucked back from her face, about the sound of his voice on the far side of a campfire, about the weight of his attention, and how it had felt nothing like what she had expected. "I know a place that does a decent steak," she said. He smiled, and she thought again that it was one of the finer things she had seen. They had dinner that evening at a restaurant on the main street of Abilene, a place that was not fancy but was clean and well lit, and they sat across from each other with actual food in front of them for the first time in weeks, and the conversation moved the way it always did between them. Quickly, honestly, with frequent divergences and returns, like a river that knows its own bed. She told him about the man at the Cimarron, which she had not written in any of her notes. She told it simply, without drama, as a thing that had happened and that she had handled, and he listened with the kind of attention that was wholly on her face, and when she finished there was a quality in his expression that was not pity. She was deeply grateful it was not pity, but was something more like respect combined with a barely visible anger on her behalf that he kept quite controlled. "I should have been ahead of you," he said. "No," Ellen said. "That is exactly the wrong way to think about it." He looked at her, she held his gaze. "I handled it," she said. "I am good at handling things. That is the whole point. I do not need you to have been ahead of me. I need you to respect that I was there alone in difficult territory and I managed it correctly." Luke was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You are right, and I do respect that. The two things are not incompatible." "They are not," Ellen agreed. "As long as the respect comes first and the protective instinct is an addition rather than the whole thing." "Understood," he said, and she believed him. They talked for 3 hours and walked back to her boarding house in the warm May night, and at the door he stopped and looked at her and said, "I would like to do this again tomorrow." "You are welcome to," she said. "And the day after that," he said. "I'm not going anywhere immediately," she said. "I have been paid for a drive, and I intend to spend some of that money on things that are not dried beans." He laughed, and she laughed too, and he said good night with a kind of reluctance that she found she was not at all sorry about. He came back the next day, and the day after that. Abilene in early summer was a different creature from the quiet trailing town she had ridden out of 2 months earlier. The cattle money had come in and the whole district was loud with it. Merchants and buyers and gamblers and men who had worked hard and intended to spend hard, and the streets were full from morning to late at night with the particular energy of a place at the peak of its season. Ellen moved through it with easy competence, finding the parts she liked and avoiding the parts she did not, and Luke moved with her in the way that two people move together when they have decided on each other without quite having said so yet. They went to the stockyards on the second day to see the cattle settled and sorted, and Ellen talked to 3 different buyers about prices in a way that made Luke realize she knew the economics of the business as thoroughly as she knew the trail itself. She had been watching cattle markets since she was old enough to understand what her father was talking about at the dinner table, and she had a good head for numbers and a practical understanding of how supply and weather and timing interacted to move prices up and down. On the third day, walking along the river at the edge of town in the late afternoon, Luke stopped on the bank and looked at the water for a moment and then looked at her. "I need to go back to Missouri," he said. "I have some business there that I have been putting off for 2 years. My brother has some property questions that need resolving." Ellen looked at him. Something in her chest took note of this. "How long?" she asked. 3 or 4 weeks, he said. "Maybe less." She nodded. She had known this was a transient sort of world. Men moved through it constantly, following work and opportunity, and there was nothing unusual about a man having business in another state. She understood it practically and she felt it personally, which was a slightly uncomfortable combination. "After that," she said. He turned toward her fully and there was nothing cautious or measured about his expression. "I am coming back," he said. "If that is something you want." "It is something I want," she said, which was possibly the most direct thing she had said to anyone in years, and she felt the truth of it completely. He looked at her for a long moment and then he took her hand, which he had not done before, and it was a simple and serious gesture that said more than most speeches. His hand was warm and calloused and completely certain. "Then I am coming back," he said. He kissed her that evening, standing outside the boarding house in the dusty gold of the late light. And it was the kind of kiss that a person does when they mean what they are doing, not hasty or uncertain but deliberate and warm, and with a quality of arriving that she recognized from the first moment of it. She had her hands on the front of his shirt, and his hands were on either side of her face, and the whole of Abilene was going on around them with its noise and its cattle smell and its late-season energy, and none of it was relevant in the slightest. He rode out the next morning for Missouri, and she stood in the street and watched him go, and then went back inside and ate breakfast, and began thinking about what she intended to do with herself for the next few weeks. The answer turned out to be quite a lot. She approached 2 other outfit managers about the same arrangement she had provided for Hargrove, and one of them, a man named Dunnett who ran a smaller operation out of the Flint Hills, hired her on the spot. She spent the next 3 weeks riding the preliminary route for Dunnett's fall drive, and she did it with the same quality she had brought to the Hargrove drive, carefully, thoroughly, and ahead of everyone else. She also wrote to her father's old lawyer in Gonzales County about the Bristol property, which had been managed in a provisional way since her father's death, and which she had been putting off settling for 2 years because the logistics of it from distance were complicated. The lawyer wrote back promptly and laid out the situation, which was more straightforward than she had feared. The land was hers by inheritance, free and clear, and she could do with it as she chose. She thought about that land. 200 acres of good South Texas country with adequate water and enough grass for a small herd. She had grown up there. She knew every foot of it. Luke came back on a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of June, 4 weeks to the day after he had left, and she knew it was him before she heard the horse because she had developed, somewhat involuntarily, a certain awareness of his proximity that she could not entirely explain in practical terms. She was at the livery checking on Sable when she heard the particular footfall of a horse on the packed earth outside, and she stepped out into the afternoon light, and he was there. He looked rested in a way that 3 days of trail work could not have produced, which meant Missouri had been good to him. His brother's property questions had been resolved satisfactorily, he told her later, and he had spent a week with his brother's family and slept in a real bed and eaten his sister-in-law's cooking, and he looked like a man who had been reminded of what life could feel like when it was not conducted entirely from a saddle. He also looked, when he saw her, like a man who had spent 4 weeks being reminded of something else. "You look well," he said. "I had work," she said. "Done its fall drive." He nodded, taking that in, still ahead of everyone. 3 days at least, she said. "Sometimes 4, he smiled. "Good." They had dinner that evening, and the conversation had a different quality to it. Easier and also more serious. The way it gets between two people who have spent time apart thinking honestly about things and have come back with more clarity rather than less. Luke told her about Missouri and about his brother, who was a farmer now and content with it, and about the way he had felt riding back into Kansas the day before, which was a feeling he described with the slightly self-aware quality of a man unused to talking about feelings. Like the country fit differently, he said. Like it was the right direction. Ellen was quiet for a moment. "I have been thinking about the land in Gonzales County," she said. "My father's property. What about it? I think I want to go back," she said. "Not permanently necessarily, but to see it, to decide what to do with it." She looked at him steadily. "I have been wondering whether you would have any interest in South Texas." Luke looked at her across the table for a moment, reading what was behind the words, which was more than just a question about geography. "I have some interest in whatever you are interested in," he said. She held his gaze. "I am asking something specific, Luke." "I know you are," he said. He set down his coffee cup and looked at her with the full directness that she had come to know as one of his most reliable qualities. "I am asking it too. I am just being less precise about the words because I am slightly nervous, which is not a condition I am particularly experienced in." Ellen felt something large and warm move through her. "You are nervous," she said. "I have ridden into flood crossings with less anxiety than this conversation," he said. "That is very strange," she said, though she was smiling. "I think I want to stay near you," he said plainly. "Whatever form that takes, if that means South Texas, then I want to see South Texas." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "Then I am going to show you South Texas," she said. They rode south together in July, which was a different kind of riding than anything she had done before, not the solitary, purposeful advance of a scout, but the easy pace of two people with the same destination, and she found that she liked it enormously. They talked and were quiet in turns, rode side by side when the trail was wide enough and single file when it narrowed, and stopped at springs and rivers to rest the horses and eat and watch the country move through its afternoon light. They argued twice about route choices, and both times ended up combining their approaches, and both times the combined route turned out better than either individual choice, which she stored as a piece of information she intended to keep. They arrived in Gonzales County on a Thursday morning, when the South Texas summer was in its full burning force, the air smelling of cedar and caliche, and the particular dry sweetness of a country that has been itself for a very long time. Ellen rode onto the Bristol property through the old cedar gate that her father had built, and she stopped Sable for a moment and just looked at it. The low house with its limestone walls and its covered porch, the tank at the foot of the slope, the long pasture running east to the creek. Luke stopped beside her and was quiet in the way he was quiet when he understood that silence was what the moment needed. "My father built that fence," she said, pointing to the cedar post fence that ran along the south pasture. "I handed him posts for 2 weeks when I was 8. "Good fence," Luke said. "He was good at fences," she said. She rode on slowly, through the gate and up the slope to the house, and the feeling that came up in her was not grief exactly, though grief was part of it. It was more like recognition, the particular sensation of a place that knows you and that you know, that has been waiting in the way that places wait. The lawyer in town had arranged for a neighboring family to watch the property and keep the house in basic order, and it was habitable though dusty, and Ellen spent the afternoon cleaning while Luke worked on a pump that had developed a leak and fixed a section of fence that had come down. They did not discuss why he was doing this rather than sitting in the shade. He simply picked up the tools and went to work, which was the thing she needed and which he understood without being asked. That evening they sat on the porch and watched the sky go orange and purple over the hills to the west, and the air smelled like cedar smoke from the fire they had lit to keep the mosquitoes off, and she thought that she had not felt this particular quality of rightness in a place since before her father died. "What do you think?" she asked. Luke was quiet for a moment, looking at the land. "I think it is good country," he said. "I think it has been well cared for and could be again." "Could you be here?" she asked. The full question behind that one was obvious to both of them. Luke turned to look at her. In the fading light his face was unhurried and certain. "Ellen," he said, and just the way he said her name had a quality she could feel in her hands. "I could be anywhere you are, but if I am being honest, I think this place has the bones of something worth building on, and I would like to be part of building it." She looked at him for a long moment. Her heart was conducting itself in its undignified way again, and she was not remotely interested in stopping it. "I think we should get married," she said. Luke blinked once, and then his face broke into the full, unguarded smile that she loved best, the one that was not managed or composed but simply genuine. "I was going to get around to asking that," he said. "I know," she said. "I got there first. I tend to do that." He laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes from genuine delight, and she felt it like warmth. "I noticed," he said. "It is one of the things I love most about you." They were married in Gonzales in August of 1874, in a small ceremony at the county courthouse, with the lawyer who had handled the Bristol estate as a witness, and a woman named Clara Deering, who had been a friend of Ellen's mother, and who wept throughout the entire proceedings in a manner that she described as joy, and that Ellen believed entirely. Luke's brother and sister-in-law could not make the trip from Missouri on short notice, but they received a letter from them within a month that contained such genuine warmth that Ellen felt she knew them already. The months that followed were the months of building. They took on the Bristol property in earnest, spending the fall assessing the land and the water and the possibilities, and Luke brought to it the same quality of practical intelligence he brought to everything, which was the quality of seeing what was there rather than what he wished were there, and working from that honest foundation. They ran a small herd initially, 20 head of well-chosen longhorns from a neighbor who was reducing his operation, and Ellen managed the cattle with the same competence she had managed everything else, and Luke worked on the infrastructure, the fences, the buildings, the water system, with a thoroughness that made the place steadily better. They disagreed sometimes. About cattle handling, about money, about whether a particular section of fence needed replacing now or could wait until spring, and they disagreed in the honest and direct way of two people who respect each other and trust that the disagreement will get somewhere useful, which it usually did. Ellen was not always right, and she knew it, and she said so when she was wrong, and Luke was not always right either, and he said so when he was wrong. And this mutual honesty was the thing they had established from the first night at the Cimarron Spring, and maintained without much effort because it was simply how they were. In the spring of 1875, something happened that neither of them had fully let themselves anticipate because anticipation felt risky, and that was that Ellen was expecting. She told Luke on a March morning while they were drinking coffee on the porch before the workday began, which was their habit now, that quiet morning interval that belonged entirely to them before the day took over. She told him simply and directly as she told him most things, and he put down his coffee cup and looked at her with an expression that she had never quite seen on his face before, something wide and still and very full. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am entirely well," she said. "I feel fine. I am simply telling you because you need to know, and because I wanted to be the one to tell you." He reached over and took her hand and held it, and neither of them said anything for several minutes, and the morning came up around them with its bird noise and its horse smell and its early light on the cedar hills, and it was one of the best minutes of either of their lives. Their son, Martin Luke Alden, was born in October of 1875, named for Ellen's father, and for his own father in a combination that felt right without needing discussion. He was born at home with a midwife from town, and he arrived in the world with the loud and comprehensive authority of someone who has opinions and intends to make them known. And Luke, who had been a composed and capable man in many difficult situations, found that the moment they put his son in his arms, he was temporarily beyond composure in the most complete and satisfying way. Ellen looked at him holding the baby, this trail-hardened man standing in the bedroom of her father's house with his eyes bright, and his expression entirely dissolved into something tender and amazed. And she thought that she had been right about him from the very first time she read what his eyes were doing when he was not trying to manage his expression. Thomas Hargrove came through Gonzales County the following spring on a cattle buying trip and stopped to see them, partly out of old-time business connection, and partly, Ellen suspected, out of genuine curiosity about how the Bristol woman had landed. He was a man who learned from evidence if he lived long enough, and he sat on their porch and looked at the property and the herd and the fences and the tank, and he looked at Ellen and Luke and their son, who was by then a 6-month-old with his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair and the general air of a person who finds the world entirely interesting. "Fine operation," Hargrove said. "Thank you," Ellen said. "I should have hired you on proper from the start," he said. He said it plainly, without excessive ceremony, the way a man says a true thing when he has finally gotten around to saying it. "You should have," Ellen agreed. She said it without anger, simply as the truth that it was. Hargrove nodded. He drank his coffee and said nothing else about it, but she felt that it had cost him something to say, and she respected the cost even if she did not feel any particular need to soften it. Luke walked Hargrove out to his horse when he left, and when he came back to the porch he found Ellen sitting with the baby on her lap, looking out at the late afternoon light on the pasture. "You were gracious with him," Luke said. "He said the right thing," Ellen said. "Eventually." "Eventually counts," Luke said. "It counts," she agreed. "It is better than never." He sat down beside her and stretched his legs out and looked at the land. It was a good time of year, the spring grass coming up green and thick after a wet winter, the cattle looking well, the cedar hills with their particular blue-green color that Ellen had known all her life. She had ridden 400 miles ahead of everyone to prove what she could do, and she had done it, and the proof had mattered in ways she had not fully anticipated, because the most significant consequence of it had nothing to do with cattle or trails, but had everything to do with the man sitting beside her now, who had seen her markers at a cottonwood on the Red River bank, and had come to find her and had not stopped coming. She leaned her shoulder against his, and he turned his head to look at her, and she at him, and there was nothing that needed saying in that particular moment. A year passed, and then another, and the Bristol property became the Alden Ranch by gradual and mutual transformation, though they kept the Bristol name on the gate out of respect for her father, and because it was right. They ran their small herd up to 60 head by the end of 1876, adding carefully, choosing their stock well, learning the particular personality of their land and working with it rather than against it. Luke built a new barn that winter, a proper one with a good roof and solid posts, and Ellen managed the herd through a cold January without losing a single animal, which was better than most of their neighbors managed. Colton Webb, who had been Hargrove's foreman, came through in the fall of 1876 with a message from Hargrove asking if Ellen would consider scouting the Spring Drive route again. The message was respectful and the money was good, and it was, more than any other single thing, a thorough and practical acknowledgement that the argument against her had not only failed to hold up, but had been entirely reversed by the evidence. Ellen read the message twice, sitting at the kitchen table with Luke across from her drinking coffee. "What do you think?" he asked. "I think Martin is a year old and I am not leaving him for 2 months," she said. "He will be older next year," Luke said. Ellen looked up from the message. There was a quality in Luke's expression that was entirely neutral in the way of a man who has a thought and is choosing to present it without pressure. "You mean you would come," she said. I mean that we have neighbors who would look after the ranch for a few weeks, and Martin is healthy, and I have thought a number of times about riding that trail again," he said. "Together, properly." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You would come as my partner." Not as the trail foreman and the woman scout, as two scouts with the same standing. "I would not have it any other way," he said. She looked at him for a moment and felt the particular depth of that, which was not a small thing. She had spent years being told where she belonged and where she did not, and she had answered all of it by being ahead of everyone, and now she had a partner who was beside her rather than above or below, and that was the thing she had not known she was working toward until she had it. "Right back to Hargrove," she said. "Tell him we come as a team or not at all." Hargrove wrote back within 2 weeks. He accepted their terms. They went on the spring drive of 1877 together, riding ahead of the herd with Martin left in the reliable care of Clara Deering, who had become a close enough friend by now to be trusted entirely. They rode the Chisholm Trail north again through the same country Ellen had ridden alone 3 years earlier, and it was a different experience and also the same in the most essential ways. She was still 3 days ahead of the herd. She still tested the crossings and marked the trail and wrote her careful notes. But now there was Luke beside her, adding his own knowledge and his own eyes and his own judgment to hers, and they moved through the country with a combined competence that was more than the sum of its parts. They stood together at the Red River crossing, at the very bank where she had sat eating an apple the first time he had ridden up and seen her, and Ellen looked at the water for a moment. "This is where we started," she said. "More or less," he said. "I was sitting right there," she said, pointing to the rock. "I know," he said. "I remember the apple," she laughed. "You came riding up with your whole outfit behind you, and you found a woman eating an apple, and you said, 'Show me the upstream crossing,' and I thought, this might be a person I can talk to. I thought you were the most assured person I had ever seen in a difficult situation," he said, "and I had seen a considerable number of people in difficult situations." "I was nervous," she said. He looked at her. "You were not." "I was a little nervous," she said. "I just did not show it, because I had learned early that showing uncertainty gives people permission to dismiss you. I showed the competence. I kept the nervous part for later." Luke looked at her with the expression she knew best, the full and warm and attentive one. "You could have shown the nervous part to me," he said, "from the very beginning." "I know that now," she said. She turned and found his hand. "I did not know it then." He raised her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to the back of it, which was a gesture of his she had come to treasure for the deliberate tenderness of it, and then they turned back to the river and the work. The drive of 1877 went smoothly in all the ways that mattered. The crossings held, the weather cooperated for most of the route, and they brought Hargrove's herd into Abilene only 1 day behind schedule, which was considered excellent time for an 800-head push over 400 miles. Hargrove met them at the stockyards and shook both their hands, and he shook Ellen's first, which she noticed, and which cost him nothing and meant more than he probably knew. Back in Gonzales County that summer, with the drive money paid and the ranch looking better than it ever had, they sat on the porch on a July evening, and Ellen told Luke she was expecting again. Luke set down his coffee cup in the same way he had the first time. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am entirely well," she said. He looked at her with that same wide, still expression, and then he said, "A second." "A second," she confirmed. Their daughter was born in February of 1878, a cold and bright morning when the Cedar Hills had a rare dusting of frost and the air smelled like winter even that far south. They named her Clara Jane Alden, for Clara Deering and for Ellen's mother, whose name had been Jane, and she arrived with the same loud authority as her brother, but added to it a quality of absolute certainty about what she wanted that was going to make her, they could already tell, both a significant challenge and a formidable person. Martin, 2.5 now, regarded his sister with the particular expression of a child who has been the center of things and is revising his understanding. He sat next to Ellen on the bed and looked at the baby with great seriousness. "She is small," he said. "You were small, Ellen said. I am bigger now, Martin said, with complete logic. She will be too, Luke said from the doorway, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed and his expression entirely undone, which was the expression he always had when he looked at the three of them together. The years settled into the rhythm of the ranch, which was a rhythm that had its hard seasons and its good ones, its difficult months and its abundant ones. And Ellen and Luke moved through all of it with the competence and the honesty and the directness that had been the foundation of everything between them since the first conversation at the Red River. They argued sometimes, as they always had, and resolved it the same way through honest engagement rather than retreat or stubbornness, and this kept the arguments from accumulating into something larger than they needed to be. Ellen never stopped riding ahead. Even in the context of the ranch, she was always the one who went first, who checked the pasture conditions and the water sources, who rode out before dawn to see what the weather was doing and whether the cattle were settled. Luke teased her about it gently and without any irritation behind it, because he understood that it was not restlessness but the specific expression of who she was, and he valued who she was without qualification. In the fall of 1879, when Martin was 4 and Clara was nearly 2, they took on a third drive for a different outfit entirely, a man named Jasper Coates who had heard about them from Hargrove, and who made the offer with the explicit understanding that he was hiring 2 scouts of equal standing, or he was hiring neither. Ellen had not asked for this framing. Coates had arrived at it on his own, because Hargrove had told him plainly that the arrangement worked as a unit, and that breaking up the unit was not worth the efficiency loss. This was the drive where Luke was thrown from his horse. It happened in Indian Territory, on a rainy afternoon when the footing was uncertain, and the horse slipped on a clay bank and Luke went down hard on his left side, and Ellen was 20 yards away and turned at the sound and was off her horse before most people would have processed what they had heard. She reached him while he was still lying in the mud, conscious but winded and clearly in pain, and she did a quick and methodical assessment. His eyes were clear, he was breathing, his arms moved when she asked him to move them, but the left side of his ribs was producing pain that she recognized as either badly bruised or cracked. I am fine, he said. You are not fine, she said. Your ribs are either cracked or badly bruised. You need to stay still. The herd is being handled by 11 drovers who know what they are doing, she said. Stay still, Luke. He looked up at her, lying in the mud with the rain coming down, and there was something in his face that was between pain and a kind of gratitude that was too large for the moment and therefore clearly about something larger than the moment. You are very good at this, he said. I know, she said. Now be quiet. She got him to the camp wagon and made him stay there for 2 days, managing both their scouting work herself for that interval, and at the end of 2 days he was functional again, though he moved carefully, and she watched him with the quiet, steady attention of a person who will not say they are worried, because saying it changes nothing, but who is keeping track of every detail regardless. His ribs healed. It was bruising rather than a crack, which they were both grateful for, and by the time they reached Abilene he was moving freely again. But she did not forget the 2 days of watching him in the camp wagon, and he did not forget her face when she had reached him in the mud, and they talked about it on the last night before Abilene, lying on their blankets under the stars with the herd settled in the distance. I was scared, she said, which was a thing she said rarely. I know, he said. Not for the drive, she said. I know, he said again, quieter. She was quiet for a moment. I thought about the ranch without you in it, she said. And the children, and yourself, he asked. She was quiet again, longer this time. And myself, she said. Yes, and myself. He reached over in the dark and found her hand. I am here, he said, bruised but intact. Entirely intact, she said, with a certainty she was putting into it deliberately. I intend to keep you that way. I will do my part, he said. She moved closer to him in the dark, and he put his arm around her, and the stars were enormous and the night was quiet, and the herd breathed its steady, slow breath in the distance, and she thought that she had built the thing she wanted to build, which was not just a property or a reputation or a skill, but a life that had room in it for all of her. The scout and the rancher and the wife and the mother and the woman who was 3 days ahead of everyone and intended to stay that way. In the morning they rode into Abilene for the last time together on a drive. They had already decided it, quietly and mutually, in the way they made most decisions. The ranch needed both of them now. Martin was 4 and Clara was 2, and they had a life that was rooted in Gonzales County in the way of a tree that has grown into its specific ground. And the drives had given them everything they needed to give, the money and the reputation and the evidence. And now the rootedness was the thing. Coates paid them well and thanked them with genuine warmth. And Hargrove bought them dinner and told Luke that the woman he had turned away in the spring of 1874 had made more money for his outfit over 3 drives than any single hire he had made in his career, and that he had been a fool and was glad the story had not ended with his foolishness. Ellen looked at him across the table and thought that she was glad too, though for reasons that had nothing to do with Hargrove's profit and everything to do with the man sitting beside her. They rode south together in October of 1879, back down through the country they had ridden so many times, back through Indian Territory with its wide and serious sky, back across the Cimarron and the Canadian and the Red River, and each crossing they passed brought something back and let something go. And by the time they rode through the Cedar Gate with the Bristol name on it, Ellen felt that they had arrived in the fullest possible sense of the word. Not just at a place, but at the thing a place becomes when it has been chosen and worked and loved. Martin ran out of the house with his boots on the wrong feet, because he had put them on himself and was very proud of this regardless of the orientation. And Clara came toddling after him with the determined stride of a child who intends to keep up regardless of the leg-length disadvantage. And Ellen slid down from Sable and caught them both, and held them and looked up at Luke over their heads, and his expression was the one she loved best. They rebuilt the south pasture fence that winter, the two of them working side by side in the cold mornings, with the children playing in the dirt nearby. And it was good work and honest work, and the kind of work that becomes something larger than its practical function, when the people doing it understand why they are doing it. By the spring of 1880, the Alden Ranch was a known operation in Gonzales County, not the largest in the area but one of the most consistently well-managed, with a reputation for good stock and reliable water, and the particular quality of a place where the decisions were made carefully. They had neighbors who respected them and a small community of people they trusted, and the lawyer from town came out occasionally for dinner and stayed too long because he enjoyed himself, and Clara Deering remained the closest thing to family that the distance and time had allowed. Ellen turned 32 that spring and felt it in the best possible way, the way of a person who has used the years they have been given and has something to show for it. She was in the fullness of her strength and capability, both physically and in the deeper sense of someone who knows who she is and has stopped waiting for that to be acknowledged before acting on it. One evening in April, she and Luke sat on the porch after the children were asleep, and the night was soft and the cedar hills were dark against the last light, and he turned to look at her in the particular way that meant he was thinking about something real. "We should write it down," he said. "Write what down?" she asked. "How we got here," he said. "For them." He nodded toward the house, toward the sleeping children. Ellen thought about that. She thought about the spring of 1874, and the Hargrove yard and Colton Webb's flat laugh and Thomas Hargrove's courteous closed door. And she thought about riding south out of Abilene at dawn with her bedroll and her provisions and her determination. She thought about the Red River markers and the Cimarron crossing and the gravel island and the notes folded into split branches along 400 miles of trail. She thought about the first time she had heard Luke's horse coming across the open country toward her camp and the way that sound had made something shift in her chest. "Yes," she said, "we should write it down." "Tell me where to start," Luke said. "Start at the gate in Abilene," she said. The morning I rode in and every man in the yard stopped working. Luke smiled. He looked at the dark hills. They should have known better. They did not, she said, but I showed them anyway. You were 3 days ahead of all of them, he said. At least 3, she said. He reached over and took her hand, and they sat with the spring night around them, and the ranch was quiet, and the children were asleep, and the land was theirs, and the story was theirs, and the life they had built from a roan mare and a bedroll and an apple eaten on the bank of the Red River was so entirely and completely theirs that it seemed to fill the night around them like light. In the years that followed, Ellen and Luke worked the ranch through all its seasons, through the dry summers of the early 1880s when the tank ran low and they moved the cattle carefully to manage the grass, and through the wet winters when the creek ran full and the cedar hills were as green as anything she had seen anywhere. They expanded slowly and deliberately, adding a few head each year, improving the infrastructure, building the kind of solid permanence that is not flashy but that lasts. Martin grew into a boy who was curious and capable, and who had inherited his mother's directness and his father's patience, which was a useful combination, and who could ride by the time he was 5 in a way that made Luke proud without surprise. Clara grew into a girl who was fierce and determined, and who had her own opinions about everything from the age she could form words, which Ellen recognized as familiar, and Luke handled with the calm amusement of a man who had always been attracted to exactly this quality in a person. Ellen continued to ride out before dawn most mornings, a habit she had developed on the trail and maintained on the ranch, covering the pasture and the water sources and the fence lines with the same thoroughness she had brought to the Chisholm Trail. She was always the first one to know where the cattle had drifted, where the fence needed attention, where the water level in the tank was getting low. Luke called her his best early warning system, which was meant affectionately and was also simply true. She taught Martin to scout before she taught him to rope, which he thought was strange until he understood what it meant to actually see the land before moving through it. She told him about reading grass and reading sky and reading water, about the difference between what a place looks like from the outside and what it tells you when you have been patient enough to learn its language. She told him about a scout's responsibility, which was not to conquer the country ahead of you, but to understand it well enough to move through it honestly. He was a good student. He was patient and observant and willing to be wrong, all 3 of which were qualities his mother told him were more important than being right. Clara, for her part, decided at the age of 6 that she intended to ride better than anyone in the county, which was an ambition that nobody in the Alden house felt any particular need to discourage. In the fall of 1882, Luke rode over to the neighboring property to help with a fence repair after a storm had knocked down a long section of cedar posts. And while he was there, he heard from the neighbor, an older man named Garrett, about a property 3 miles east that was going up for sale. Garrett described it as fair land with a reliable spring and good grass, smaller than the Alden ranch, but adjoining it in a way that would make the combined property more useful than either alone. Luke came home that evening and told Ellen about it over supper, and she listened with the particular attention she gave to things that mattered. "How much?" she asked. He told her the price. She thought about it for a moment. Then she said, "We have enough." They bought the property the following month, and it was indeed good land, and the spring was indeed reliable, and they moved a portion of their cattle onto it the following spring with good results. Martin, now 7, insisted on riding the new fence line with his father on the first morning, sitting his horse with the straight-backed competence of a child who has grown up learning the right things, and Ellen watched them go from the porch, and felt something she could only describe as the full and satisfied completeness of a life that had been made rather than received. She stood on the porch for a long time after they rode out of sight, with the morning coming up golden over the cedar hills, and she thought about the gate at Abilene and the dismissal and the flat laugh in the closed door, and she thought about the answer she had given to all of it, which was to ride south at dawn and then north 3 days ahead of everyone, proving what she could do in the most direct way possible, not with argument or petition or appeal to fairness, but with the undeniable weight of the work itself. She thought about Luke, who had ridden forward to find her at the Red River and had never stopped moving toward her since. She thought about her father's land and the fence he had built, and the cattle he had run, and the way that a person's life, if you were lucky and honest and willing to do the work, could grow from what they gave you into something that was entirely your own. When Luke and Martin rode back at mid-morning, both of them dusty and satisfied, Luke swung down from his horse and came up the porch steps and looked at her with the eyes that still had the same quality they had always had, that quick and warm and entirely genuine attention. "Good fence line," he said. "Tell me about it," she said. He sat down beside her and told her about the fence line and the spring and the grass, and she listened. And Clara came out and climbed onto Luke's lap and informed him that she had found a lizard behind the woodpile, which was apparently significant news. And Martin sat on the porch steps and cleaned his boots with the methodical air of a boy practicing being a man. And the morning was warm, and the cedar hills were blue-green in the distance, and the land ran away in all directions under the wide Texas sky. She was 34 years old and had built everything she had built by going first, by being 3 days ahead of everyone and not apologizing for it. And she had found the one person in her world who had ridden forward to meet her there and had stayed beside her ever since. And the whole of it, the land and the cattle and the children and the man and the fence her father had built and the fence they had built together. The whole of it was so completely right that she sat with it in the full light of the morning, without needing it to be anything other than what it was. Luke looked at her and she looked at him, and Clara was still talking about the lizard, and Martin had moved on to cleaning his saddle, and the day was opening ahead of them with its work and its light and its ordinary irreplaceable beauty. And Ellen Bristol Alden, who had been told she had no business on a cattle drive, and had answered that impossibility with everything she had, sat on the porch of her father's house and held the life she had made and found it very, very good.